Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages as they come into us here at Sky Centre. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Christina Patterson and also the columnist at the article, Ali Miraj. Lovely to see you both. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, let's see what is on the front of some of those papers. And the Sunday Times leads on a poll that has found that more than 50% of people would expect delays to their NHS treatment if they were to fall ill. The Observer reports that unions are coordinating strikes for this autumn in protest against the rising cost of living. The Sunday Mirror says 5 solo acts and 1 group are planning to sue Simon Cowell's firm, claiming that they were bullied on The X Factor. A spokesman for the show said it isn't aware of any legal claims being filed against it. The Sunday Express focuses on comments by the outgoing Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who has promised extra support will be announced by his successor next month for those struggling financially as energy prices soar. The Daily Star on Sunday leads on news that the man accused of killing 9-year-old Lilia Valutite in Lincolnshire has been stabbed in prison. It says he is lucky to have survived. The Sunday Telegraph is reporting that Prime Ministerial candidate Liz Truss is mulling what it is described as a nuclear VAT cut of 5% to tackle the cost of living crisis. The Sun claims Prince Andrew's daughters have asked Prince Charles to allow their father to return to royal duties. Neither Buckingham Palace or a spokesman for the Duke of York wish to comment on the story. The Sunday People is warning that the energy crisis could spell the end of the Sunday roast, which is costing as much as £5 just to cook. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch along with us. And we are joined tonight by Christina Patterson and Ali Miraj. And thank you both so much for giving up your Saturday evening to take us through these papers. Let's just start with the Observer and their front page story. Their lead is unions to join force for wave of strikes over cost of living. And Christina, do you feel it is now inevitable that we are going to have waves of strikes over the coming few months?
Well, it's certainly looking like it. And I have to say, it's beginning to, I'm old enough to remember doing my physics homework by candlelight in the 70s. And it is beginning to feel like the 70s all over again, although actually much, much worse in the sense that the kind of inflationary rises we're looking at, and certainly the energy price rises, are sort of unimaginable and unprecedented. So Unite and Unison are apparently joining forces to hold strikes. And as we know, we've already had masses of strikes on the trains with the RMT, and we've had the mail workers striking. So it is beginning to look as if we might have something that's not actually a general strike, but that the unions are trying to aim for something that has a similar effect. And whatever you think about the rights and wrongs of people striking, I think pretty much everybody, unless you are super rich, pretty much everybody in the country is now extremely worried about what's happening economically and the energy crisis. And I don't blame people at all for thinking I'm not going to be able to afford to pay my bills, and my pay rise or lack of it is not going to help in any way at all to paying my bills. So I think we are looking at a very, very difficult time ahead, sadly. And I think this isn't going to make Liz Truss's new job any easier.
Ali, do you agree with that? I mean, do you think that there is a lot more public sympathy, perhaps, for strikers these days? I mean, over the last sort of 10, 15 years, when we look at things like rail strikes, etc., there's been a certain amount of public irritation about them. But I've noticed that with the recent rail strikes and indeed the bin men strikes up in Edinburgh, a lot of members of the public, when asked, have sympathy because they too are going through a cost of living crisis.
Well, earlier today, I was listening to Tracy Chapman's 1988 hit song, Waiting for a Revolution, or Talking About a Revolution, which talks about the workers rising up and claiming what's theirs. And I think if you've got a capitalist system, and I am a capitalist, by the way, I do believe in the profit motive. I believe in people working hard and toiling and getting wealthy if that's what they so choose to do. But in a capitalist system, you can't have a situation where when you're heading towards inflation of 13% and someone at Citigroup saying we might be heading to 18%, workers suffering and not being able to pay their energy bills, which have just gone up by 80%, 80. and forecast to rise even higher. People are rebelling, and you're quite right, Jayne, that there hasn't been the public outcry that you saw in the 1970s because people understand how difficult it is for ordinary folk to put bread on the table and earn a crust. I mean, 5 to 10 million households in this country are really, really looking down the barrel of a gun effectively with these energy price rises. And we also appreciated during COVID that it wasn't just the white collar workers that actually deliver for this country. It's the blue collar workers, the dustbin workers, the nurses, the people who serve us in all sorts of ways that keep this country going. And therefore, I do think there is a lot of empathy with people to get a decent wage. Now, I'm not in favor of inflationary pay rises because I do think that you can enter a wage price spiral, but there has to be sense seen in terms of these discussions. I think that both sides have to come together and try and resolve them. But look, the Observer is basically saying that Unite and Unison are going to coordinate their action at the Trades Union Congress, meetings coming up next month. And effectively, whoever the new Prime Minister is, and at the moment the polling's showing it's Liz Truss, they're going to have the most horrific in-tray to deal with as soon as they take office.
And if we move on to the Telegraph, Christina, one possible solution, their headline, if it is Liz Truss, looking at the option of a 5% cut in VAT. In your mind, if this were to happen, would this be a solution? Would this actually make enough of a difference to people?
Well, guess what? I'm not an economist and I'm not someone who can work out a quick solution to the energy crisis, which is pretty much stymieing every Western leader at the moment. Though it has to be said, the European leaders seem to be doing a much, much better job. And the price rises, the energy price rises that most countries in Europe are facing are a fraction of ours. I mean, we're looking at sort of up to 200% by next April, which is unimaginable. So I don't know if this will help, but what I do know is that Liz Truss, it's interesting, people were asked to give words that they associated with Liz Truss, and a word cloud was formed of it, and I'm afraid some of the words that were used were very rude, and I wouldn't dream of quoting them here. But the word that came across most strongly was untrustworthy, or untrustworthy, as you might want to say. And I'm not surprised by that, because she certainly has a reputation for flip-flopping. She changed her mind about Brexit, she changed her mind about the Lib Dems, she's changed her mind about the royal family. She seems to be changing her mind all the time, and she has been going all out to woo the Tory party during this contest by promising tax cuts, which would benefit the super rich by far the most. I mean, the sums are incredible, that the number of people who, I think the same amount of money would go towards bailing out the top 1% as would bail out the 60%, something like that. I may have got that wrong, but it was a kind of breathtaking statistic. So she has essentially been saying from the beginning in the Tory contest, no handouts, which apart from anything else is an incredibly offensive way of putting it, as if, these are people refusing to work and, kind of wanting to be paid by the taxpayer to sit around and eat chocolate. What we're talking about, as Ali said, is people who are working extremely hard to earn a living who will not be able to pay their bills. And I very much doubt there's been a couple, a family, friends in the country who haven't talked about how the hell they are going to manage to pay these bills and what they're going to do about it and what they're going to have to give up. So it may be that a 5% VAT cut would be pretty radical, and it's modelled on the action that Gordon Brown took during the financial crisis of 2008 when he cut back temporarily by 2.5%. And that probably would make some difference. Whether it would make enough difference remains to be seen. Well, indeed, but she's certainly going to change her mind.
Let's get Ali's thoughts on this before we run out of time on the subject. And I mean, do you think, aside from the broader economic principles, do you think that this would mean at least a level of help for those who are struggling the most?
Well, I certainly think that the no handouts policy is just not going to work. I mean, this 5% VAT cut is going to cost about 30 billion, but that's not going to touch the sides either. And nor is this a scrapping of the green energy levy, which is going to yield about 158 quid to the average household. And reversal in NI is not going to meet the needs either. There's going to have to be a huge fiscal intervention here. This is on the back of the war in Ukraine. We've got the Prime Minister telling us that golden days lie ahead. That's all very well. But frankly, this is boosterish claptrap. I mean, the reality is that we are suffering on the back of the war. I'm not saying that we should not support Ukraine. If that's a policy that's been agreed upon, then the government is going to have to step in, do a massive fiscal intervention, which is going to cost hundreds of billions of pounds, because there's no clear idea of how long this war is going to last. It could last months, it could last years. And this is going to mean that our children and grandchildren are going to be paying the price for this, as they are on the back of COVID. And just to conclude this point, when you borrow, you have to pay interest payments. Interest payments are going to be going up in a world of rising interest rates to curb inflation. So people should always remember that governments will only tax you or borrow. That's the only way that they raise money. Or they can print money, which is the third way, which is absolutely appalling thing to do. And in a world of rising interest rates, we are going to have to be paying a hell of a lot of money just to service that debt going forward.
And you mentioned Boris Johnson and this golden future he's been talking about. That is the front of the Express, isn't it? And Christina, very briefly, I mean, do you think this is, as Ali said, boosterish claptrap, that there are good times ahead and that the government has all got a plan? He's left it in a fantastic state.
I think it's utterly offensive to say this at this time, not least because he has done precisely nothing to help people. You know, he's been a zombie PM for the whole summer. He could have announced something. He could have done something. He claimed it all had to be left for his successor, by which time it will be too late for many. In A&E, doctors are reporting suicide attempts from people who say they are worried that they already cannot afford to pay their rent, to buy food and to pay their energy bills in summer. So it's frankly deeply, deeply offensive. I think he's probably talking about the lucrative office he's got to make speeches, and maybe he's got muddled up, as he very often does, because he has no eye for detail. But it's absolute nonsense. The next few years are going to be very, very tough, and his boosterism is just deeply, deeply offensive to the British people at this time.
OK, Christina and Ali, we're going to pause there and we're going to take a break. And coming up after the adverts, more papers, including the front of The Sun on Sunday. It says, "Be plea, give dad a job, Charles." On that and the rest of the papers after the break. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, the journalist and author Christina Patterson and the columnist at The Article, Ali Miraj, and they're taking us through their choices of the front pages and some of the inside pages. And Ali, let's start with you this half. The Times, page 1. This is about NHS treatment. Apparently now the majority of us just expect delays when we embark on any course of treatment with the NHS. Are we just all being a little bit more realistic?
I think that's true, but this, Jane, this is saying that 58% of people believe that the NHS will not be for them, not be there for them, rather, if they were ill tomorrow. Now, that is a pretty damning statistic. I do think that we have to be a little bit sensitive and understanding to remember that the NHS has gone through the most dire couple of years, probably in its history, dealing with a COVID backlog. You know, people have been working their fingers to the bone, and there's a 6.7 million waiting list. So I do think the public has to understand that. However, the issues with the NHS are long-standing, are not just linked to COVID. I mean, the Civitas think tank had a report out recently that just said that we spent £10,000 ahead on the NHS, one of the highest, the third highest in the European area, and we have one of the worst outcomes in the developed world. I mean, you've got a situation here where you've got 50,000 excess deaths a year and life expectancy one of the worst in the developed world. Something is not working somewhere. It needs to be looked at. It needs to be reformed. But look, I need confidence at the moment amongst the NHS workers themselves is a very low ebb, and there's a huge amount of vacancies as well that need to be filled.
Christina, is Brexit to blame for this? Part of the problem?
Well, Jane, you won't be surprised to hear me say that, yes, it is. They're now madly trying to recruit nurses and health workers from around the world, and there are big attempts to essentially steal or poach nurses from India and Sri Lanka, where, frankly, they're probably pretty needed in their own country. But now they have to go through complex visa systems. There are whole agencies devoted to sending people out at vast expense to countries around the world, trying to find the workers that were lost after Brexit, who could work here legally without any visas, without any problems at all. It was a massive, massive shooting in the foot enterprise, and the net result has been really bad for the NHS. And I know from people who work in the NHS that morale is incredibly low. They felt, clapping in the streets didn't really cut it. People felt extremely unsupported during COVID. The general sense was that the NHS coped with it. Well, actually, there were plenty of places where people were very sadly left to die on their own. They were left to die in hospital corridors. And now we have a situation where people with heart attacks and strokes are waiting at least an hour for ambulances, and in some cases, many, many hours. I think, this is not sustainable, and we're just going to have to kind of take more radical action. And Ali is right that, in fact, we are not a very, in global terms, even though the NHS, there's much to be proud of, we don't perform very well for the money we spend. And I think, it's underfunded, but it also needs to be better run, and probably fewer managers and more doctors and more healthcare workers.
OK, we're going to move on because we haven't got very long left at all. Just try and get a couple more papers in. The Telegraph, Ali, Jacob Rees-Mogg, he was well known for going into all of these civil servants' offices and finding empty desks and leaving notes on them. And now he said, right, we're going to sell the offices in central London. If you're not coming into work, you can work from home. You can work somewhere else, Leeds, Yorkshire, somewhere far away from London.
Well, look, I've got an element of sympathy. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg, I'm not a massive fan of, but I do have some sympathy with the fact that if people are changing their working patterns, and we know that a lot of people are sort of doing this hybrid working mode, that is going to put pressure on offices in terms of space that's not being used. I mean, it does cost a lot in real estate. And at the moment, the government's going to have to be finding cuts wherever it can to pay for the dire fiscal position it's going to be confronted with. So I do have some sympathy. The issue that Jacob Rees-Mogg is going to have is that civil service morale is really at a very, very low ebb at the moment. And with strike action writ large across the public sector, the last thing the government needs now is civil servants to also be striking and also to have their morale in the gutter further than where it is right now.
OK. And finally, Christina, only 30 seconds left, but The Sun on Sunday says someone else who's got low morale, Prince Andrew, but apparently his daughters are asking Prince Charles to give him his job back. Should he get his job back?
Yeah, well, good luck with that. I mean, I think the reason that Andrew has low morale is widely known and pretty justified. And let's just say that you don't pay what is rumoured to be a good £10 million in an out-of-court settlement if you have done absolutely nothing wrong. Well, so okay. I'm afraid I would say the chances of Andrew getting a job from Charles are pretty limited.
OK. Christina and Ali, thank you both so much for taking us through your choices. Great to talk to you this evening.